The following is a presentation of Geekster Media.
Remember that show back then? Remember that show? Turn on the TV, time was always flying. Why did they have to end? So many shows you forgotten. Now that we've got a podcast, we can release all the shows from our hands. Yeah, will you be the most TV dudes you'll ever listen to? As long as we keep on talking sitcoms and cartoons from back in the day. Okay, we confess we're obsessed, but we got a podcast to help you remember that show. Hey there, TV lovers, and welcome to episode 23 of Remember That Show, the podcast where we revisit the obscure or forgotten TV shows of the 80s and 90s. I'm Adam Pope, and Bigfoot eats out of my garbage can all the time. So does Mothman and the Jersey Devil. What's the big deal?
And I'm William Bruce West, and if you ask me, something eerie is going on around here in this suburban paradise. But before we get into that, we've got to take a look at our own TV-obsessed childhoods in a segment we call Theme Song.
So, Will, there's a lot of urban legends brought to life in the show we're going to be discussing on this episode, but that's a phenomenon that goes on nationwide, especially with stories about television celebrities, it seems. So, for example, we all heard in the 90s that Marilyn Manson was actually Paul from the Wonder Years or the older brother from Mr. Belvedere, Rob Stone, depending on your region, right? So I am curious, what's a weird celebrity rumor that you heard on the schoolyard growing up or just on TV even?
Well, we talked about it in the Shusha episode, but it was Shusha herself, you know, like on the schoolyard, people would say she was this like Swedish porn star. And like, we didn't have the internet. So how did that travel around? Like, were we stereotyping? It's like, well, she's hot and she looks Norwegian and I'd pay to watch her. So yeah, who connected those dots, you know? But like, honestly, one of the weirdest is one I learned recently. Like, it wasn't even schoolyard. This is like adulthood, but it pertains to when I was in school. So everybody knows that Cal Ripken Jr. had that whole like streak of like played games. He didn't miss a game. I forget where he was when the count finally ended. Like, he voluntarily surrendered, you know, because he's like, this is enough. Like, nobody's ever going to match this. It's been enough games, right? So it's like, I don't like sports, but I like collectibles. So I knew the cards. I collected baseball cards. And like Cal Ripken Jr. was a hometown hero, mainly because he like had perfect attendance. Like, his stats aren't that great, but like he always showed up, and that's what counts. So the rumor is, and it's called the rumor around here, that at some point in the early 90s, Cal Ripken Jr.'s wife had an affair with Kevin Costner, who happened to be in town. And Cal found out and a fight ensued. And they say that Cal was so beat up that he wouldn't have been able to play the game that night, but it would have broken the streak. So miraculously, there was a power outage at Camden Yards and the game had to be canceled anyway. So at this point in time, Cal doesn't really address it. He's moved on with a new wife. Kevin Costner laughs it off because they used to ask him when like Yellowstone was really getting traction, like in interviews, is there any truth to this rumor? And he'd kind of like poo-poo it, but not enough to make you believe him. So like, that's kind of the thing now, is like, did Kevin Costner almost ruin the streak? Baltimore like conspire to make sure no game was played without Cal?
Well, sports adjacent, I would say. I know the one big one we probably both heard, being interested in professional wrestling, was that the Ultimate Warrior had died after he left the WWF. And when he came back, it was a different Ultimate Warrior because his physique was a little different. His hair was a little different. So everybody like had all these, theories that were going on around there. I don't know if this one counts, but there was a kid in my elementary school who claimed that he hung out with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles after school every day. He said he would go in the sewer after school. He'd eat pizza in their lair. He was was getting trained in ninjutsu by Master Splinter. When I challenged him on it, he brought ninja throwing stars as proof, but would only show them to me when we walked to the neighborhood across the street after school, right? I was like, okay, well, then take me down there. I want to meet him. He's like, oh no, they don't want everybody to know about it. I was like, oh. So I pretty much believed him though, because to me, ninja stars, that was like irrefutable evidence, right? And I didn't know until years later that you could just order them from an ad in Black Belt magazine, you know, go to a swap meet.
I love that you challenged him. In this day and age, with schools being what they are, if someone tells you he knows ninjas, you don't come to school tomorrow. But you're like, no, prove it to me.
It was a revelation. I was like, but they live in New York City. They live in California now? I can't believe it. They're in the sewers, and there was a sewer drain and manhole cover in my cul-de-sac at the end of my driveway. And it took all my willpower for about a year not to climb in there and start hunting for Mikey and Raph. And I got brave enough, actually, by the time I was in junior high, and I was exploring sewers and drainage canals and stuff like that all the time, bringing my flashlights, doing stuff with my friends. But I never found any evidence of the TMNT anywhere. So,
You're that kid wasting my tax dollars when they got to go in and rescue you. Well, this series is less concerned with Hollywood and more with the weird happenings in a small town. So, Adam, was there a strange occurrence that you witnessed or heard about in your hometown?
Well, in the past, I've talked about my dad and I living in a dead guy's house. So I've told that story. But before that, I lived down the street from a murder house that was abandoned for years. We were the safest city in America. That's what we were told. And these things were happening. But my parents never told me about that. When I went down there and passed it, it was like 2 houses over from us. And so I was just always empty. Nobody ever lived there. And I'm like, why is that? But I never asked and they didn't tell me. I only actually learned about it because one day my friend's mom was driving me home and like all her brothers and sisters were in the van with us. And her older brother goes, hey, isn't that house where that guy killed his wife? We read about it in the newspaper. And his mom's like shushing him, because I was only like 8 or 9 at the time. But of course, after that, I asked my parents about it and they told me the story. And apparently, like this guy and his wife, they got into like massive debt and he didn't see a way out. It's not a happy story. So he shot his wife to relieve her of the burden so she wouldn't have to deal with the debt. And then he shot himself. And so like nobody lived there after that. Obviously, it was reported on, people knew about it. And 2 years later, finally, a family with kids moves into the house. And of course, I work up the courage to ask if they knew about the story. And one of the daughters, she said, sometimes she would be hearing weird crying in the house, and that wasn't from her brothers and sisters. So it was like, ooh. But on a lighter note, I will just say, I was at a random babysitter's house once. My mom just dropped me off with this girl I didn't know. She's just like, she's a babysitter for you. Okay. And they had a barn on their property. This was like one city over from us. It was a little more rural in Southern California, rural. But anyway, so they had a barn structure in the backyard. And I just kind of asked, I said, what is in that? What do you do with the barn? Can we go out there? She's like, oh no, the ghost of Scooby-Doo lives there. And I was like, what? The ghost of Scooby? Why? And it just shattered my 5-year-old world. I had Scooby-Doo on the wall of my bedroom. I had Scooby-Doo board games. And not only now was I learning about the death of Scooby-Doo, but he was haunting a barn. Like he was one of the ghosts he used to hunt with Mystery Incorporated. So it was a mind-bending experience. I've never forgotten it, but I want to know who that girl was because I would now get a kick out of her twisted sense of humor, but it was kind of messed up. She did it at the time.
I got some terrible news for you, Adam, because that was a meth lab. And you were never going to find her.
What was the happenings that were spooky in Maryland?
There aren't any because, like, I'm not far enough out. I'm too close to DC. So, like, the scariest weird thing to me was, like, when Independence Day came out, they said that the diameter of the ship was 15 miles. And I'm, like, exactly 15 miles from the heart of DC. And I've kept that with me for, like, 27 years at this point, where I'm like, well, when they come, I just got to drive a couple miles north. and I'm out of the blast radius, you know? But like Maryland has things. I mean, keep in mind Blair Witch, that's a local kind of thing, you know? There's like a dividing line. You get out into like the farmland and it's like you could have a Blair Witch and you could have a ghost and all this. But you get into the city and like you're getting closer to your Candymans and your things like that. So like we'd more than likely have the ghost of some like forgotten Kennedy relative, and that hasn't really happened. So not really a lot. I've had more like UFO sightings, things like that, but like the paranormal doesn't really come to Wheaton.
That's interesting. Okay, yeah, because I just feel like there's so much history back east in that area. There'd be some like headless horseman type red coat or something that people talk about. But all right, well, here's the thing. We're talking about red coats, but we want to know about green lights. So we got to find out what was going on in the world of television that made this series materialize. So, Will, while suburban family life was the main focus of the early hits of television, things like Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver, The Donna Reed Show, by the 60s, there were already some macabre subversions of this familiar trope hitting TV screens. Shows like The Munsters and The Addams Family took normal sitcom plots and replaced the familiar nuclear family members with gruesome but lovable monsters and maniacs. Meanwhile, anthology shows like The Twilight Zone were often featuring stories of everyday American citizens finding horrors lurking in the shadows of their neighborhoods. Even at the movies, Tim Burton was adding like a goth layer to the cookie cutter world of the suburbs in Edward Scissorhands. But it wasn't until 1990, I feel like, with David Lynch's Twin Peaks, that the concept of the dark side of suburbia just kind of oozing between the slats of white picket fences promised by that American idealism of the 50s, which was all the rage in the 80s, really seemed to take hold in pop culture, because that mystery of who murdered Laura Palmer was water cooler talk that television viewers just couldn't resist. I feel like our show that we're going to be discussing takes a lot of inspiration from this kind of cult primetime drama. So I am curious, Will, as someone who was so locked into television at this time, do you have any memories of the Twin Peaks phenomenon?
Yeah, the commercials were always coming on, and like Who Killed Laura Palmer. And I remember when like Fire Walk with Me came out, which was a weird sort of phenomenon to me from a business standpoint, because here you have a movie continuation of a TV show. Today, that wouldn't really be weird, but back then it was like, so this is a low-rated show, but they think there are enough people who are gonna go to a theater. Like 10-year-old Will was thinking like that, So it's like, I remember it, but I never watched it because it just looked weird and adult and scary. But to me, it is the first show that it seemed like people started building their like identities around. It was almost like your introduction to fandom. Like, oh, that chick's kind of weird because she really loves this show a little too much, but like, what about you?
Well, I mean, I'm like you. I remember seeing like Twin Peaks promos. I remember seeing it on the cover of TV Guide. Like Kyle MacLachlan all of a sudden just appeared. Like, to me, he just came out of nowhere as a celebrity. Obviously, I never watched it for the same reasons as you. I'm like, I'm a little kid. This just looks like some drama that's a little too dark for me. I don't even think it was on in my house. Like, my mom was way more interested in Dynasty and soap operas and things like that. My dad was just watching reruns of MASH when he'd get home.
Like a real man.
That's right. He's got pure dad energy, my dad.
Right.
But I have since seen like Blue Velvet, for example, which is kind of like the proto Twin Peaks to the extreme in movie theaters, right? Like that one's crazy, but a very similar vibe. And I own now like the extended version of the Twin Peaks pilot on VHS, but it's like, it's not a favorite in any way. I'm not one of those people that found it and said, oh, wow, why doesn't everybody know about this? Why does everybody watch this? It's kind of a fascinating oddity to me that I know, which is like people loved the first season. And then by the second season, it was kind of like, it doesn't seem like you're going anywhere. So it was an interesting moment in time that I vaguely recall.
Right. And it's like, I own the complete series because like, it's me, I have to, but I have no desire to watch it, even though it's on the list. So maybe down the road, we'll force each other to get through it so we can talk about it. Well, a primetime TV show starring teenage actors in the lead roles might seem like an odd choice for a traditionally adult time slot, but in 1990, the television landscape was leaning towards the youth market. For example, NBC already had a hit with Blossom, while Fox had success with a show we've covered previously on the podcast, Parker Lewis Can't Lose. In the late 80s and 90s, The Wonder Years was already a well-established hit on ABC with Fred Savage in the lead as Kevin Arnold, a show which ran concurrently with Neil Patrick Harris as Doogie Howser, MD. So, with a TV audience hungry for an exploration of weirdness in suburbia and primed to accept a teen star, it makes sense that NBC would take a chance on Eerie, Indiana, starring a relative unknown child actor who could become the next TV star worthy of a photo spread in Tiger Beat. Adam, can you think of a teenage actor who really stood out to you as a star on TV in the 80s and 90s?
This is going to seem a little strange for a lot of people, I think, because we named some of these people, or at least the shows they were on, but I really thought Maureen Flanagan, who played Evie on Out of This World, was a star that was destined for great things, not just to be lost to the world of syndication. You know, like, I thought she was like going to be in movies, and she was, some low budget movies, but she just had like a great confidence. She was very relatable on screen. The fact that I only ever saw like a Frosted Flakes TV commercial where she's playing volleyball with Tony the Tiger and then nothing else, I was just like, where did she go? And I know she's had like guest spots on every drama, like every show, you know, she still works, but I just thought she would get another TV series at some point, but it never happened. And looking at her now, it's kind of interesting. She kind of has a Kristen Bell look to her. So I wonder if she just lost her spot. It's like Kristen Bell came in, you know, now it's like, well, we don't have anything for you, Maureen. Sorry.
Yeah, that's really how it works sometimes. I mean, I can probably think of two, and they're both kind of in the same cohort. First up is Larissa Olenek, who was Alex Mack on Nickelodeon. Like, I didn't grow up with cable, but I knew Alex Mack. That was like the only thing. Like, people love all that, but I wanted to see Alex Mack on Snick because she was adorable, and I thought she would go far. And like you're saying, she's out there, but she's not really doing anything. Like, she's a working actress. And similarly, Anna Schlumsky was in My Girl, but then, like, I guess more recently she was in Veep. But like, again, I thought she was gonna be huge. Like, it's easier, I feel, for like the women, but it's also shorter because Hollywood's evil, you know? But like, I expect like the female actors to have like their 15 minutes while like the guys just dominate for 30 years like a George Clooney. But even from like, I used to think about these people who were like just on the cusp. Like, I had this like blog thing I wanted to do called like the unsung heroes of pop culture. And one that always stood out to me was Bumper Robinson. That's not a household name, but if you watched a sitcom in the 80s and 90s, you knew who he was because he was the black guy. But like, he was more of like a Bruno Marsy kind of black guy. There was something else in that recipe, but he was the cool guy. He was the crush. Like, I remember Sister Sister, they saw him on a bus and they fell in love with him. Like, he played a teenager for like 25 years, and it was just one of those things of, you knew him when you saw him, but he never got that, and that kind of always bothered me.
Yeah, Bumper Robinson's one of those guys who was on everything, but he was never the star. Like, I love the Generation X TV movie that came out in the late 90s on Fox. And hey, he's versatile because he was playing a Samoan. Yep. He was a black guy. They changed his character. He was one of those guys that I like, whether he was a little kid or when he became an older teenager, and then he started doing a lot of voice acting work. Yep. He was on Futurama and things like that. You know, so it's just like, it was great to see him always around, but yeah, it's so strange that he was never the marquee name.
The voice acting thing hurt me though, because it was like Tara Strong, where you're like, you're hot. Why are you hiding in a studio? What is going on here?
Oh, well, I mean, it's hard to say. Maybe he just didn't have the right way to sell himself as the star of a series. But hey, some producers knew what they wanted to put together, and they were able to get it on network TV. We got to find out what they did with their elevator pitch. So, well, Eerie, Indiana premiered in primetime on the NBC network during September of 1991 and ran until December of 1993, only technically producing one season of 19 episodes, one of which was never broadcast. Now, the series was revived to air on the Disney Channel cable network in 1993 as a syndicated program, essentially, for about 3 years. And then it got moved over to the Fox Kids network in 1997, and it gained enough popularity that a sequel series was produced in 1998 called Eerie, Indiana, The Other Dimension, which we will surely talk about as we get into Show Doctors, because that's a whole other can of worms. But the series was created by burgeoning TV writers Jose Rivera and Carl Schaefer with help from Joe Dante. Obviously, Joe Dante known for films about small towns besieged by madness, Gremlins and The Burbs, even later on Small Soldiers. And he was also directing just a little bit before episodes of Steven Spielberg's fantasy anthology series Amazing Stories. And though Eerie, Indiana did get a full line of books eventually that were set in that universe once it started airing on Fox Kids, there was also a Wendy's Kids Meal tie-in made up of creepy toys. I've actually found them at thrift stores in the past, still in the package. But I'm curious, with all that moving around, Will, did you remember hearing about Eerie, Indiana during any of its runs on network or cable?
Yeah. The weird thing is, like, I don't remember it existing on NBC at all. And I'm trying to remember that era. Amen is basically over. So maybe I'm like leaving NBC at that point. That whole run is just, it doesn't exist in my timeline. But I do remember it on Fox Kids. Like, that's where I remember it from. I did get the impression it was from somewhere. You know, it wasn't a Fox Kids original. They had just kind of like taken it on, kind of like they did with Round the Twist, which was that Australian show, which was also about like weird events in a town, but it was funny. I was like, oh, they're doing Round the Twist again. You know, so like it was that kind of deal. But yeah, the prior life on NBC and Disney Channel, no clue. And even when it was on Fox Kids, it was just kind of like, as long as this isn't preempting X-Men or Power Rangers, y'all can do whatever you want to do. But how about you? What's your history with it?
Well, I am sure that I must have seen a promo for it at some point because the name Eerie, Indiana has been in my mind for a long time. But I think it was probably during the Disney Channel era, during a preview week, because like I remember I had seen Omri Katz in Hocus Pocus by that point. And even there was another movie that used to air on the Disney Channel that I loved called Adventures in Dinosaur City. It's a really trippy, fun movie. It could almost be an episode of Eerie, Indiana, actually. But all that being said, I never watched it. It was on Amazon Prime. You know, you could stream it a few years ago. I watched like 3 or 4 episodes with my wife, and then we just didn't fully binge it. We were over it. In fact, I found the complete series DVD box set at Goodwill about 6 months ago, and I didn't even watch it then because it's out of print and very valuable. So I just threw it up on eBay immediately. It'll get you 30 or 40 bucks at least. So for this show, this is the first time I've watched it all the way through and been really able to absorb what it's all about.
Yeah, well, I mean, the series focused on the character of Marshall Teller, played by Omri Katz, whose family moved from New Jersey to Eerie, Indiana, where he immediately began to notice strange phenomenon going on in the town, like a mother who packed away her twin boys in Tupperware to keep them young forever, or a friend whose retainer picked up the frequency of dog voices in town who were plotting a takeover. Marshall befriends a younger local boy named Simon Holmes, played by Justin Shinkaro, who joins him as a sidekick on most of his investigations, which the boys document through a camcorder, an archive of artifacts that they tag after each case. They frequently spend their time at the local malt shop called World of Stuff, which also sells novelty items and other products for kids. Each episode was a standalone mystery to be solved with a rotating group of directors like Joe Dante, Bob Balaban, Tim Hunter, and Brian Spicer adding their own flair to the stories. Halfway through the series, the show was slightly retooled to have a running mystery of an amnesiac teen boy with gray hair named Dash X, played by Jason Marsden, who would be an instigator of further trouble for Marshall and Simon, in addition to the bizarre townsfolk of Eerie.
Yeah, so there's a lot of intricacies going on in this show, a lot of fun things. So I am very curious to find out where we land on Eerie, Indiana with our cheers. So I will just start out here, Will. I will say I love the format of Eerie, Indiana. Like, each episode is basically a mini movie. You got your new weirdo of the week, and it's like an anthology series, but it's set in a consistent universe. And best of all, you've been hearing my criticisms for so long, it's only 30 minutes. And it's just like what Eerie, Indiana accomplishes in like such a short runtime. It's amazing. Like, and so many shows that we've covered on the podcast, it's just like filler, filler, filler. This is just like carefully crafted. Each one has its own vibe, but it still maintains a familiar look. It's got a tone. It keeps the show cohesive, but it's also shot on film. So it's kind of like soft and dreamlike. Like, it really takes you into a different headspace when you're checking about that. But what do you just think about the concept of a 30-minute show?
Yeah, I agree. Like, I loved that about it. When it came up that we were doing it, I was scared it was going to be the hour format. And I'm like, okay, 19 42-minute episodes of this. I ain't got that in me. But 30 minutes is perfect. Like, I watched it on both Tubi and YouTube. And it's like, with the Tubi on, you don't even notice it's 24 minutes. You know, like, there's no fat. Like, they use every minute, and I agree with you, like, the way it looks. I'm glad you mentioned it was done on film. That's one of my, like, blind spots where people are like, oh, the movie was done on film. Like, I don't know what that means, you know, but I know it when I see it. So I'm glad you made that distinction, because we've always said, like, one of my mutant powers is to tell you what network a show should be on. And, like, I kind of like that I look at this and I can't answer that. Like, it's not like anything else on TV at the time, which might have been to his disadvantage, but like, it certainly did carve out a unique swath for itself.
It really did, yeah. Now, part of that too, though, and one of the things that maybe could have brought in some people to at least feel a little bit more comfortable, is the cavalcade of familiar character actors. It is just one after the other. It is wonderful. Just a few. Matt Frewer, John Aston, Dick Miller, Vincent Chiavelli, Renee Auberjonois, Ray Walston, Stephen Root, Claude Akins, Mark Blankfield, so many more. So it's a who's who of fascinating faces who then really get to let loose and be as weird as they look. You know, that's what these people were getting paid for. They had a thing and they get to go full force in this. It's so great.
Oh yeah, there's a ton of like, oh, it's that guy, you know, because it's like all the people we don't know their names. Like you said, Vincent Chiavelli. And of course, I see the credit on the screen, but I don't connect the dots like it's him. But he's in everything. He's got that face. So it's just kind of like, it's a who's who of that guys.
Yeah, it's just a joy to have them. But then you have the consistency of the Teller family, right? So you have Marshall and his family. And I think the chemistry between all those actors is perfect. Like, they're all written as if they're off living their own lives. Like, you know, the parents, the sister, they're always doing something. It's not like everything revolves around Marshall. They're always off to work, or they're studying, or they're on a date, or whatever. But then they come back. They have meals together. Like, they're committed to being a family unit. And especially like the sister, Cindy in particular, she's really interesting because like she teases her brother, but then she gives him advice. And she's interested in his love life. And then she's just generally concerned a few times, you know, when there's danger or whatever. Like, it just feels very real for a show that's set in such a bonkers universe.
Yeah, I agree. They're a real family. They're not a TV family. Like you said, they're all doing their own things to their detriment in a way. Like, I'm trying to be real careful because a lot of the things that stand out to me, some people would think of as jeers, but like their chemistry is realistic in that they have a real family dynamic where like life takes over and maybe like you're not the focus of each other's lives, but you still make points to come back to it. Like I made the note that dad has this kind of like Reed Richards aloofness to him where like he's always working or like absent-minded where he doesn't know what's going on with his family. Luckily, they don't seem to take that out on him. Like they don't seem to resent him like Sue Storm does, but it's still kind of like it's jarring because it's not funny. You know, it's not played for laughs. He's just kind of the absent-minded inventor for like TechCo or whatever the weird MacGuffin company is he works for. You know, it's like the sister. They don't build up this whole thing of like, oh, brothers and sisters have to fight. You know, that was like a trope in TV when we were growing up. It can be somewhat detrimental. Like I grew up where like my first cousin and I were really close just because of the nature of our family. But it was also strange in that we're 20 years apart because my mom had me so late. So TV trained me to be a jerk to her. And I had no reason to be, but like I was taught that in this dynamic, you were supposed to read her diary and make fun of the things she liked. And you know, it's like a show like Eerie, Indiana would have helped a kid like me a whole lot.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, there isn't like the sibling rivalry. Like the dad makes dad jokes, but they're not actually funny. Like nobody has clever dialogue. That's not the point. They're all just supposed to be there, and maybe that'll end up in a jeer. I don't know. But I do want to mention too, like we kind of said towards the end of the season or the back half of the season, they really do kind of change the tone and the focus a little bit. But like the early episodes, I feel like are very anthology style. My favorite of those, I think, is The Lost Hour, where Marshall doesn't want to lose an hour to daylight savings time. So he refuses to set his clock back, but that causes him to wake up in a limbo world version of the town that's empty because the rest of Eerie is 1 hour ahead of him. And then there's this old milkman who drives around the town and he's telling him, I can help you to escape, but first you have to rescue this girl who he realizes was on his milk carton that morning as a missing child because she got lost in that lost hour dimension. And she's played by Nikki Cox. So of course I was thrilled for that cameo. I was like, Nikki Cox is so great. But there's also these trash men who go around collecting things and people who are not supposed to be in that dimension. So there's that like danger. There's like, oh, there's somebody after us. So it's a fascinating concept. It's really well executed. Like literally you can look into the back of the milkman's truck and you appear on the missing child, picture that is on the side of a milk carton, and Marshall at one point talks to Simon. He's like, Simon, you gotta help me. But then he has to do it all himself. But it's just kind of funny how that plays out. But I just love the twists of these episodes. Everyone is different. You're not seeing repetition in any way. And that's just one that really stood out.
I didn't get to watch that one, and I wish I had, because that sounds like really interesting. But it also goes to show you that, like, it was swinging for the fences towards a lot of potential audiences. Like, when it got to Fox Kids, it's clear we're marketing this towards kids. But this is not a kid show. At best, it's a family show. This is for the families that watched E.T. together and maybe watched the Monster Squad together. Like dad can explain temporal anomalies to the kids when they watch something like this. So like, again, maybe that was to his detriment, but it was still trying something different.
Yeah, well, and I'm curious, was there an episode for you that you did get to watch where you're like, okay, I'm liking where this is going? Uh-oh. Hey there, TV lovers. Adam taking a break here to tell you about our sponsor for this episode, HalloweenCostumes.com. Now, for the best Halloween costume ideas for this year's festivities, HalloweenCostumes.com is the place. Whether you are searching for a costume for Halloween night or need the perfect outfit to wear to your upcoming murder mystery party. Remember that episode of Saved by the Bell? Their costume selection is larger than any other Halloween store in the industry. It's their mission to provide an unmatched experience when you are shopping for Halloween costumes, accessories, decor, and costume apparel. They carry high-quality costumes and accessories such as wigs, hats, masks, and costume boots, sure to provide costume ideas for everyone, and all at a price that'll fit even the tightest of budgets. The perfect Halloween costume is only a couple clicks away at HalloweenCostumes.com. And while you're browsing, the selection selection of Halloween costumes for kids or baby costumes, don't forget to treat yourself to a little Halloween fun. HalloweenCostumes.com has a large selection of adult costumes, sexy costumes, and even pet costumes. You might even want to take a look at their couples costumes ideas or a group Halloween costume for a larger crew. Many of their styles are exclusive, and we are confident that you will find something you like in their costume store. Even though they carry cheap Halloween costumes, that doesn't mean that the quality suffers. HalloweenCostumes.com prides themselves on superiority and believe their customers deserve the best costume experience at a reasonable price. So you can go on over to geekstermedia.com and click the link there. You'll automatically get 20% off, or check the link in our show notes. But enjoy your browsing at HalloweenCostumes.com. And now back to the show. Well, there's one that I hope you got a chance to watch because I felt like this was tailor-made for us and for our show. Because basically, like, the final episode of the series that aired is called Reality Takes a Holiday. And it's a completely just meta experience where the Marshall character crosses over into another reality, maybe our world, but probably not, where Eerie, Indiana is a TV show that Joe Dante is directing. Does that sound familiar? Like, all the cast members who play his family and friends are like shown out of character as warped, narcissistic actors. It's behind the scenes. You go behind all the flats for their sets and all those things. Like, the dad is like a pretentious theater actor. The mom is all tatted up. She's wearing a leather bustier under her costume. Like, she takes off her top. She's kind of like sassy and stuff. And then even the kid who plays Simon, he's a womanizer who's obsessed with money in the industry and all that kind of stuff. But the crazy thing is that Dash X kid, he has also crossed over with Marshall, and he has figured out how to manipulate the writer-producer, who's played by, Mark Blankfield, James, the actor waiter on Saved by the Bell. And he's like talking him into doing a storyline where they kill off the Marshall character, but they're really gonna kill him. So it's just like a really fun way to end the series, like just playing with all that stuff. I was recently actually on the Totally Rad Christmas podcast where we were talking about Bionic 6, and that episode is not going to be out till November, but the last episode of that series did something very similar where the Bionic 6 were transported into a cartoon world and then back to their reality. They're like, maybe we really are a cartoon to somebody somewhere. But what do you think about that idea, Will?
That's one of my favorite tropes, because there's always like the cutest, sweetest character is the meanest cast member. And there's always somebody smoking. It's very like Star Trek Mirror Universe, but like, I like that kind of thing, I don't know if I realized that was the last episode of Eerie, Indiana. Like, that's a fun trope for an anniversary episode, like a milestone, like the 100th episode. Stargate did it twice, where it's like, this is the sci-fi show that's based on your adventures, but the public doesn't know it's based on your adventures because your adventures are classified, and they get to meet the actors who portray them and things like that. Great for milestones. Terrible note to go out on, though.
Yeah, it's kind of strange that they were able to do that. Technically, they did film another episode, but it didn't air until they were on the Disney Channel. But is there anything else you want to give a cheer to for this series that you can point out?
They're all good at what they do. Like, I didn't look at anybody and say like, oh, this kid can't act, or I don't get what he's trying to do. For all practical purposes, it's a good show. But when we cross over into jeers, I will tell you the second half of that sentence.
All right, well, here we go.
Boo! Boo! Boo!
Just to comment on you before you finish that thought, where you say there's no, child actors who are not so great. To me, Aubrey Katz, he's like a young David Duchovny, and your mileage may vary on that. Like, he's 90s heartthrob cute. He's got the floppy hair. He's got the look. He does an okay job at being serious and determined to solve a mystery, but that's all he does. He's a one-note character. Even when he's trying to express that urgency, it doesn't come across with any sort of intensity. And it's the same with the kid who plays Simon. He has the same line delivery for everything. And for a sitcom, that could be a comfortable rhythm for an audience to get accustomed to if it's like the cast members of Friends or something. But it kind of can get boring after a while, or lull you into just kind of being like, okay, we're just going along. But what do you think about that?
See, this is where I'm going to stick up for the show, because I agree with you, but I think it has to be that way because the weirdness is going on around them. So they're kind of the anchor. It's like, remember in that 70s show when they would get high and the way they depict it? It's that situation. Like Eerie, Indiana is the moving while like these two are stationary. They're the only ones like rooted, and that allows them to acknowledge the craziness around them. If they fluctuate or kind of have like range, then they run the risk of being caught up in the momentum of the surrounding craziness. So you kind of have to have a stoic anchor point. That's why Fox Mulder doesn't really have a personality, because there's enough going on in that world. Even Scully doesn't have a personality. Like, you look at that show and you're like, she was 26? Like, did she go to an all-girls school? Why is she just so like...
And it is partially on the actors and their kids. I understand that. But like, there's an episode where Marshall's dad creates this basically Max Headroom as an ATM machine. And you could go in and get this money, but he has a personality and he wants a friend. And to be friends with Simon, he starts giving him money. So Simon gets all this money. He could buy friends in the town, one of whom is Steve from Full House, aka Aladdin. Scott Whiter, is that it? So it's just like really fun, the concept, but he never plays like the, like, I'm a jerk personality, like to where I believe it. It's just kind of like, yeah, here we are. Here's some money, guys. You're like, okay, sell it to me, kid.
I hear you, and I think that's just part of the weirdness. They're weird in their own way.
Yeah.
But then that brings us back to the second part of that sentence for me, where the kindest thing I can say is it's not for me. And that's a really hard thing for people, especially myself, to admit. A lot of people are quick to say, like, oh, it sucks and blah, 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 because it didn't meet some, like, expectations they had. But, like, at the end of the day, I totally see how this would have a cult following. I see how it could have had a shot at succeeding. It's just not for me. Like, knowing our audience is gonna like throw some people for a loop, but I have a real problem with things that are weird for the sake of being weird. If you're just supposed to suspend disbelief and go with it and like don't ask questions, just enjoy the ride, that doesn't work for me. I only like weird if it can be explained somehow. So I would be a sucker for something like a Lost if I didn't realize they were gonna like keep doing that whole formula and shows will get canceled before they start answering things. But the whole like weird for weird's sake, I have a very low tolerance for it, and it is the exact length of Soundgarden's Black Hole Sun video. I can't take more than that. You watch the pilot of Eerie, Indiana, and the whole aesthetic of the Tupperware lady and her weird twins and all that, like that pilot was designed to drive me away. But I stuck through it because I'm like, now I got questions. How does she fasten herself in the Tupperware? And she even does the little burp, because people forget you had to burp it, get all the air out of it, you know? And then like I'm waiting for them to slip up because they're all clearly like frozen at certain points in time. Like, oh, they added a black lady. Well, the rest of them are talking about 1968. When did she get frozen? And she mentioned since Jimmy Carter. And I'm like, oh, 70s. Good work, Joe Dante. So like, I'm looking for the crack. I'm really trying to explain where there is no explanation. So that means this show isn't for me. I'm at a point in life where I can explain that. When I saw this on Fox Kids, I probably just looked at it and said, ew. But like now I can extrapolate that ew meant all of these different levels and layers. This was never going to be for me because looking at it, like I said in the cheers, I don't know who this is for. We have sort of compartmentalized audiences so much at this point that like I'm looking at it with 2024 eyes and I'm trying to get back to 1991 eyes, and I'm just sort of like, would this go after Alf? Does this go in the place of Nurses one week? Like, where does NBC put this? What did they hope for this? Does it go with Unsolved Mysteries? That would have been an interesting pairing, but wherever it was, Will wasn't gonna be there.
Yeah, well, I see what you're saying because honestly, when you're talking about your superpower, I thought, if anything, because Twin Peaks was on ABC, right? So I thought maybe this would have fit on ABC, but it's a Saturday show. It's definitely not TGIF, but it's like a Saturday show because overall, like the two main stars, in my opinion, it kind of lacks energy. The show that you're saying, weird for the sake of being weird, that it could be most directly compared to is The Adventures of Pete and Pete. But that show has so much more kinetic energy in the editing. It's got a quirky, like punk rock attitude that just flows through every second of that show. Like it started as shorts that were just like interstitials, kind of, that Nickelodeon, and like the entire show, when it went to a half-hour format, feels just like one long interstitial. Like it moves. And Eerie, Indiana, I think, is just too cinematic for television in its execution. Like the directors are all movie directors for the most part. And I think they're too used to working in that medium with like long drawn out shots and like taking their time. Whereas like in this time in the 90s, we're starting to get into that more MTV, type of editing that was expected, especially for kids programming. And I will say, like, if there's an episode that's a dud for that reason to me, there is an episode that has Danielle Harris, who I love. Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead. For those who don't know Danielle Harris, it's basically if Jennifer Love Hewitt wasn't available, you got Danielle Harris. That's how that worked. For horror fans, she's Jamie from Halloween 4. But basically, like, she comes into town and they say she has a heart condition. And then Omri Katz is all of a sudden friends with this character you've never seen before, this cool guy who skateboards, and Simon is kind of like almost not in the episode. And they're both competing for this girl's affections. The cool guy kind of wins out over Marshall and gives her a heart locket, but then he's showing off and he gets hit by a truck. So that kid dies. And then she has this locket. And so she's like, well, he's dead. So now I'm going to date Marshall. And every time she goes to kiss Marshall, she starts like, oh, my heart condition is acting up. But if she walks away from him, she's fine. Then Marshall realizes, oh, he's reaching out to you from beyond the grave. He can control your heart through the heart he gave you. And it's all this stuff, but it's a lot of like longing shots, like at the cemetery, at the guy's grave where they're talking, or it's just like, it feels out of place that it feels like it could have been a whole horror movie almost, or something like that. And, or a, it's kind of a supernatural romantic film or something like that. So, and again, if it's for kids, no kid wants a love story. It just doesn't feel like it fits in the series. And I think occasionally they take it too far in that direction where it's not what kids want. It doesn't have the excitement that a kid is looking for.
I'm glad you mentioned the distinction of it being cinematic, because that might be part of my issue too, where like I've written about this recently, but it's something I'm like coming to terms with. There are a lot of ideas out there that I'm willing to watch as a movie, but I'm not willing to invest in as a show. And I would completely watch the Eerie, Indiana movie, because that would be 90 minutes that I'd have to invest, and I walk away and I'm like, well, that was a movie, but the idea of like watching this 19 times, it's just kind of like, it's not built for that. In a time when that was the expectation, it would do very well now, having to only do 8 to 10 episodes, but like a full TV season in 1991 of what this wasn't gonna hit anywhere.
Well, and I was wondering, do you think like a fault of the series is not having some overarching narrative? We explained that this Dash X character comes in and it feels like they felt that. And they're like, all right, here's this kid who he doesn't belong in Eerie. He doesn't know about parents. He doesn't know how he got there. He doesn't know anything. And he's just existing, but he's a force of chaos and he's running around and he's going to cause trouble for Marshall and Simon. But he also seemingly wants to find out, because like different characters that come into the series, like the weird characters, like there's an alien that like visits, and Ray Walston, who played My Favorite Martian, he shows up and plays an alien again. And he's like, are you my dad? And he's just like, if only it were that simple. And you're like, huh? So it seems like that was the tease, like there's going to be some payoff, but it just feels like overall, if there's no arc for a season. There's nothing it leads to. Each episode is self-contained. Can people not get invested in that then?
Well, see, we're looking at it again from 2024 eyes because everything's expected to have that like arc and like culminate in something. Back then, no. That would have made it better in hindsight, but that wouldn't have been what they did there. They brought in Jason Marsden, but Jason Marsden was the kid equivalent of Ted McGinley in that era. Like, that's when your show is out of ideas. Check, look around. He becomes DJ's boyfriend on Full House. You know, he's like JT's friend on Step by Step. Like, Jason Marsden just had like a talent holding deal with every network, apparently. So that wasn't going to save the show. No, I think Dash X was going to be that character like Racer X and Speed Racer, or Rip Hunter, to bring wizards into this conversation. In the DC universe, there's Rip Hunter, who's like with the Time Masters and all that stuff, and he's always vague. Like, he has some attachment to Booster Gold, but is he his father? Is he his grandson? You know, it's like, because he can dance through the timeline, he's just vague about it, but you never get the answer. And I don't think we would ever get the answer here. Maybe if they knew a final episode was coming, they might have like a little button on there to be like, oh, so that's what was going on. But otherwise, you gotta remember, they were trying to bank episodes for syndication, and you can't do syndication with an overarching story 5 days a week.
That's a very good point. Well, if that's not the fix, Will, then we got to get in there. We got to see what we could do. How do we get Eerie, Indiana a second season as the show doctors? All right, I teased it up top. Technically, Eerie, Indiana had a second iteration, if you will. It had a sequel series, which is so strange. Eerie, Indiana, The Other Dimension. This literally is like an alternate reality. I don't know if you got to watch this, Will, but I watched at least the first episode just to get a handle on this, and it is so strange. It almost starts exactly the same as the pilot episode of Eerie, Indiana, but it's a different kid. Instead of Marshall Teller, it's Mitchell Taylor. And instead of Simon Holmes, it's Stanley Hope. So they're like alternate reality versions of them. And it's the same thing. This Mitchell character just moved to Eerie. He's noticing everything is strange. All that is going on. And then there's this guy who's selling, it's not quite Stay Tuned, the John Ritter film, but he's selling all these satellite dishes to everybody in town to have, I think they say like 2,000 channels or something like that. But the strange thing is, you see Marshall and Simon communicate with Mitchell and Stanley through a TV, and they're like, the weirdness from our dimension is passing to your dimension. And the same footage of them in front of a video camera from the original series, they just keep putting on a loop with static, hoping you won't notice that they're not actually like talking. And so that's like the literal handoff. And even the Mitchell character says at one point, it's like they're handing off their responsibilities to us. And so it was just bringing the show back, but Aubrey Katz and the other kid are too old now. You can't get them. So we have these kids who are not quite as charismatic, and everything in
Which
town,
is saying something.
yeah. But yeah, it was so weird to watch just the same series on a slightly lower budget and not cinematic, not on film. It's really weird to see that attempt. It's like, well, kids like it on Fox Kids. Let's do it again, but cheaper.
They gave you the Coy and Vance Eerie, Indiana.
Doing the same thing, though, was not how you got it done, because that show, again, only lasted one season. So what do you think, Will? What does Eerie, Indiana need to make it work?
Laugh track. I'd make it a sitcom. Like, I think a lot of the weirdness, a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. And I think if you injected more humor into it, I want laugh track. I want the production to tell the audience what is supposed to be funny and what is supposed to be weird. Like, in this point in TV, audiences needed to be told when to laugh at times. I think that would have made their whole enterprise more palatable. I wouldn't change anything. Well, I would do something. I don't like the cop-out of the family just moved to Eerie and here's all the stuff he notices. Because even from the pilot, even though he gives you the exposition of like mom just opened a shop and dad got this job, they don't come across as recent transplants. Like, that's more of a MacGuffin to like, this is why they don't know their neighbors. So the neighbor comes and introduces herself and she happens to throw Tupperware parties. But I think I would rather the show be he grew up in Eerie, Indiana. And it might seem like it doesn't matter, but it kind of does. Because when you were like growing up and absorbing this stuff, I think it gives him a little more credibility than this outsider who's been here a couple weeks. He's not a reliable narrator, I don't think, because he hasn't put in the hours.
Yeah, because he is explaining everything to us each episode. But yeah, you want to think like, oh, he actually is the expert, because Simon theoretically would be the expert because he grew up there, but he doesn't seem to have any opinion on what's going on. It's just as new to him each time something strange happens. So I agree that would be helpful. The question I have for you, though, is do you want it to not be on film? Do you want it to be like a multi-camera sitcom, or are you saying it's still single camera?
It's still single camera, and I know laugh track with single cam is hard because we know there's no studio audience.
Yeah.
But like that would just be the weirdness of the show. But to me, the only way the whole premise works is he either needs to grow up in the town with Simon, or if you keep it like it is, like you mentioned, Simon should notice this stuff and it all seems new to him. So you need to have, like in the 80s when Marvel did the new universe, there was the White Event. And the White Event was this weird happening where afterwards all these people had powers. I need that. And this still isn't an explanation because we don't know what the White Event would be. We just know that there is this dividing line where there's before and there's after. And now their whole premise is discovering the differences between the two. There was a UK show called Misfits about these kids who were doing community service. And like while they were doing community service, London had like a White Event. And basically random people get power. So you basically end up with the X-Men, but they're all juvenile delinquents. And you never really get into what was it that night. Was it the LHC being switched on or anything like that? It's just this unifying event that you can point to as the starting point. I feel the narrative needs that.
Yeah, I think that would definitely be helpful. And yeah, injecting more obvious humor is also pretty great because to me, it's like it's quirky and stuff is weird, but none of it is laugh out loud funny in any way. And nobody's attempting that. It's just kind of like, this is kind of weird. Hey, and you just kind of look at it that way. So to actually have like comedy writers that came in and made jokes about the weird things that were happening could be pretty interesting. My only thought actually, because I kind of do like it as it is, but I do feel we kind of hinted at this earlier that it makes more sense maybe as a series of TV movies. And if it was on ABC, like Wonderful World of Disney, maybe could have just done a series every October or a couple times a year. You got an Eerie, Indiana TV movie and you just kind of follow up with Marshall and see what's going on. Like, I think that could have helped it too. Cause like you say, you take one really cool concept and you just, expand that out and other weird things can be happening within, but there might be a sense of urgency because you got to get to the end of what is the resolution rather than, 30 minutes, we got a cool story, it resolved, but hey, there's something weird happening next week. It's weird because he is questioning it, but he's not trying to find a solution. He's just like, I want to prove to everybody that what's going on here is weird, but he doesn't have an end goal with that. Like, is he going to deliver it to the FBI? Is he giving it to Mulder and Scully to come investigate? Like, what's he going to do with all his findings? Like, it's never clear.
Well, it does seem it's not part of the show, but in his own head canon, it kind of is going that direction. Because you remember in the pilot, when he sneaks into the twins' bedroom, he gives the key to Simon to the archives. And he says, if I don't come back, what do you do? He said, I take this to the president. And if you can't do that, then what do you do? I tell your mom and dad. So it's like they want to blow the lid off this. It's just that I need something pertaining to the weirdness. You don't have to explain it to me, but you have to show me the origins. If you just show me that, like, the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs landed in Eerie, Indiana, and then they, like, time lapse to the present day, or tell me it was built on an Indian burial ground, something to just wave off, but just the town is weird because the town is weird. Like, how much story do you get out of that? Especially, like you're saying, for what? At what point does he blow the lid off things? At what point does he just give up? At what point is he like, well, I go off to college in a couple years, and then that's their problem? Like, it's
Or
just,
that's
what are we
the
doing
TV
here?
movie. The weirdness follows him. It was you. You were the one who brought the weirdness to Eerie, because if nobody else was noticing it before or mentioning it before, but all of a sudden Bigfoot is eating out of your garbage can, or Elvis moved next door, you know, like whatever's happening there, maybe it was you all along, Marshall. Maybe you're cursed. I don't know. There could be something in that. But yeah, I do feel like there needed to be a goal that he had. Whether he ever achieved it, that's not the point, but at least he's like, I'm going to do something with this. And then also, yeah, that there was some explanation for why that was occurring at that time, why it was now a weird thing that he was there. Overall, though, interesting show. I enjoyed my watch of the series, but yeah, I don't know that going back for a second season, I would be like, oh yeah, I want to do it all over again, because I think it did just need more energy, more humor, more excitement, more purpose. And maybe that destroys what the original intent was, but possibly, you know, that's what audiences were needing. So now we have visited Eerie, Indiana. So Will, we got to tell them about one more special treat that we have for the Halloween season. We are going to be doing just a short episode that we want to bring to you for Halloween. We are going to be covering an episode of a kind of obscure, sort of forgotten cartoon series. Everybody remembers the live action Punky Brewster, but what about the Punky Brewster cartoon? That's right, they did have a Halloween episode, and we are just going to get into that. It's not going to be our regular format. We're not doing the full series of segments, but we're just going to have a discussion about this moment in time. You know, we've talked about Punky Brewster on the podcast, but how does the cartoon compare? So we'll be back with that extra treat for this Halloween season, and then we will tell you what we're going to be doing in November. But for now, we're changing the channel.
This has been a presentation of Geekster Media.